The garage smelled like rust, dust, and ghosts. Frankie Miller sat on the cool concrete floor, a wrench in his hand and blood on his knuckles. He hadn't meant to fall, but the damn oil can hadn't moved since Mary died, and when his foot hit it, he went down like a sack of potatoes. He didn't yell. Didn't curse. Just sat there staring at his trembling hand, the one that used to fix carburetors blindfolded. Now it could barely open a bottle of Tylenol. Outside, cicadas hummed like an electric current under the Indiana sun. The town was still asleep, except for the dogs barking at delivery trucks and a kid zipping by on one of those silent electric scooters. Frankie looked up at the shelves above his workbench, lined with half-empty cans of motor oil, yellowed repair manuals, and a rusted-out trophy from the 1969 Tri-County drag meet. He'd taken first place in that race, then proposed to Mary right after, right there on the asphalt, grease on his jeans and fire in his eyes. That was another life. Another man. He pushed himself up slowly, knees popping like popcorn, and turned on the little CRT television mounted in the corner. He hadn't upgraded it because it worked just fine, even if everything on it felt like someone else's future. The screen flickered to life just in time to catch a news segment. And now to Tesla's latest feat of engineering, the Model S Plaid. The fastest electric production car in America, reaching 0 to 60 in under 2 seconds. Frankie blinked. The camera cut to the track, sleek silver blur, tires screaming like a war cry. Elon Musk's voice filled the garage. We're not just building fast cars. We're challenging what people think is possible. Frankie stared. Something inside his chest flickered, small, but sharp, like the click of a spark plug catching just right. He didn't know much about electric cars. He thought they looked like spaceships. He missed the rumble of a V8 and the stink of gasoline. But that voice. Musk's voice, it had something in it. Not just ambition. Not just ego. It had refusal. Refusal to slow down. Refusal to sit in a recliner and let the world pass. Frankie wiped his bleeding hand on an old rag, the kind Mary used to bleach every Sunday. He turned off the TV and looked around the garage. Dust covered everything. Not just from time, but from disuse. He hadn't built anything in over a decade. Not since Mary's cancer. Not since Emily stopped returning his calls. Not since the world shifted gears and left guys like him in the rearview. He moved toward the back of the garage, pulled a tarp off something long and metallic, his old drag frame. Nothing more than bones now. But still, it had shape. Still had lines. Still had fight. A laugh escaped his throat, low and hoarse. The fastest car in America, he muttered. Bet it can't tell a story. That night, he made coffee at 2:17 a.m. and couldn't sleep. He wandered the house like a man chasing shadows. Mary's perfume still clung to the quilt on the couch. The pictures on the wall smiled without apology. The silence was a little too loud. He turned on YouTube on his old laptop and typed, Tesla Plaid. Up came a video of Elon on stage, eyes burning with that crazy brightness, like a kid daring the universe to tell him, no. Musk looked straight into the camera. Some people think you need to be young to do great things. I started SpaceX when I was in my 30s. I was in debt. I'd already failed. Age doesn't stop you. Fear does. Frankie paused the video. The screen froze on Elon's face, wide-eyed, determined, a man chasing Mars with both fists. Frankie leaned back in his chair and whispered, what if I'm not done yet? The idea settled into his bones like heat from an old engine. He stood, opened a drawer, and pulled out an old notebook, thick with yellow pages and blue ink. Across the front in block letters, Engine Ideas, 1983. Most people collected stamps. He collected dreams. He flipped through the pages, each one full of half-formed brilliance, diagrams, sketches, wild scribbles of concepts he never had the money or courage to build. Mary used to say he had Mars in his eyes, too. He didn't know if that was a compliment or a warning. As the sun rose, casting golden light through the grease-smudged window, Frankie stared at a page labeled EV Muscle Hybrid, Retrofit Plan. He wrote that in 1996. No one cared then. But someone might care now. His hand trembled as he reached for a pen. The first line he wrote was shaky, but clear. Build something that moves. He thought about calling Carl, his old buddy from the shop, but Carl would just laugh. You want to build a spaceship now? Frankie could already hear it. And maybe Carl would be right. But maybe he wouldn't. Maybe Elon Musk was onto something. Maybe fast wasn't just a speed. Maybe it was a mindset. The next few days passed in a blur. Frankie drove out to a junkyard in Fort Wayne where he'd heard they had a total Tesla. The guy behind the desk didn't ask questions. Just pointed him toward a yard full of mangled tech and twisted steel. Frankie ran his fingers along the doorframe of what had once been a Model S. Battery was shot. Frame bent. But the core, still there. Still waiting. You're like me, he muttered to the car. Not pretty. Not new. But you got potential. He bought it for less than a used refrigerator. Had it towed back to the garage and rolled up his sleeves. First came the cleanup, wiring torn like old veins, seats ripped, screens dead. Then came the lift. The old hoist groaned in protest, but held. Frankie's back screamed in places he didn't know he had muscles. He popped ibuprofen like candy. But his hands were steady. Focused. Alive. At night, he'd watch more interviews. Musk talking about risk. About critics. About how impossible things weren't really impossible, they were just uncomfortable. Frankie started keeping a notepad by the bed. Ideas hit him at 3 a.m., at 7 a.m., in the middle of his morning coffee. He wasn't trying to build the next Tesla. He was trying to remember what it felt like to build it all. 2 weeks in, the project had a name, the Plaid Ghost. It was part homage, part rebellion, part resurrection. He didn't tell anyone, not yet. Not even Emily. She'd called once last Christmas. Short. Tense. No mention of visiting. Just, hope you're doing okay. He wasn't angry anymore. Just, waiting. Maybe this could be the thing. The bridge. He thought of sending her a photo. But he wanted to finish something first. One evening, while installing the refurbished suspension, Frankie heard a knock. A teenager, maybe 16. Stood there, staring at the frame. That yours? The kid asked. Frankie grunted. Used to be. Is that a Tesla? Frankie nodded. What's left of one? The kid grinned. That's sick. He introduced himself as Dylan. Lived 3 houses down. His dad worked nights. His mom wasn't around. He asked questions, real ones. Technical. Smart. Frankie raised an eyebrow. You know torque ratios? Dylan smiled. I've played with RCs, electric is all I mess with. Frankie handed him a rag. Then grab the 10mm and don't strip the threads. That night, they worked till midnight. Dylan's eyes wide. Frankie's soul burning. Not from pain. From purpose. Before he fell asleep, Frankie opened his notebook again. Wrote 3 words. It begins again. He didn't know if it would work. Didn't know if the battery would hold or if the frame could handle the torque. But he knew one thing, he wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. As he turned off the light in the garage, he looked back at the frame, covered in sparks and fingerprints, old and new. Maybe it wasn't the future. Maybe it was just a reminder. That even when the world calls you finished, there's always one more mile in the tank. One more rebuild. One more race. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Frankie never realized how loud life had been until it got quiet. Not the good kind of quiet, like fishing on a glassy lake or sipping morning coffee on the porch. This was the kind of quiet that clings to your skin, that echoes through walls, that makes every creak of the floorboard sound like a memory trying to crawl back into the room. The house was too big now. Mary had always called it cozy, but that was when there were casseroles in the oven and laughter in the hallway and music playing from the old record player in the den. That record player hadn't spun since the funeral. Frankie walked into the kitchen, his slippers dragging against the worn linoleum, and stared at the coffee pot like it had insulted him. He didn't drink much coffee anymore, gave him the jitters, but every morning he made it anyway, like a ritual he was too scared to stop. For scoops, just like Mary used to do, even though she liked hers stronger than motor oil and he preferred it weak. The pot gurgled to life, the sound hollow in the stillness. He reached into the cabinet and pulled down a chipped mug that said #OneDad on the side. Emily had given it to him when she was 8, beaming with pride, her little hands barely able to wrap around the gift box. He hadn't used it in years. Not since she stopped coming around. But something about this morning, the smell of oil in his garage, the ghost of excitement in his chest, the echo of Elon Musk's voice still bouncing around his skull, made him grab the mug and fill it to the brim. He took a sip and winced. Too strong. He smiled anyway. The kitchen table was littered with unopened mail. Insurance notices. Grocery store coupons. A letter from the VA. He pushed it all aside and opened the small leather-bound notebook he always kept near. He flipped to a page titled "Things I Should Have Done" and ran his finger down the list. Take Emily to California. Build that electric engine prototype. Finish the Mustang restoration. Say sorry more. The last one had no checkmark. None of them did. He closed the book. The silence pressed in again. He wandered into the living room, his eyes skimming over the family photos on the mantel. Mary in her garden hat, sun spilling over her shoulders like a halo. Emily in her prom dress, her arms slung around a boy Frankie never liked. A snapshot of all three of them at a car show in '93, standing in front of Frankie's rebuilt GTO, grinning like fools. He stopped in front of that one. His face looked younger, fuller, like he still believed time couldn't touch him. Mary had her hand on his chest. Emily's eyes were full of wonder. That was before everything cracked open. Before the accident. Before the arguments. Before the long silences turned into longer distances. Frankie lowered himself onto the recliner with a grunt and stared out the window. The neighbor's dog barked at a squirrel. A jogger passed by, earbuds in, oblivious to the world around her. The town had changed. Used to be you knew everyone. Now there were strangers in every driveway, Teslas on every corner, and a vape shop where his old mechanic's garage used to be. He'd worked there for 30 years. Ran the place like a tight ship. Guys called him Chief. Customers trusted him more than they trusted their doctors. Then one day the owner's son took over and told him they were modernizing. No more wrenches, no more grease. Just diagnostics and software. Thanks for everything, Frank. You've been a legend, the kid said, shaking his hand like he was sending him off to a retirement home. Frankie didn't say anything that day. Just nodded, took his toolbox, and walked out without looking back. He hadn't touched an engine since. Until yesterday. He closed his eyes and leaned his head back. Mary's voice came to him in bits and pieces. She used to read car magazines over his shoulder and pretend to understand them just to keep the conversation going. She'd joke about putting a nitrous system in her station wagon. We'd make it to church in 5 seconds flat, she'd say, and he'd laugh until his ribs hurt. He missed her laugh the most. The way it filled a room, made the air lighter. She'd been gone 5 years now, but sometimes he still turned his head expecting to see her walking down the hallway in her fuzzy blue robe. Sometimes he swore he heard her humming in the bathroom. Other times, like now, it felt like she'd been gone a century. The phone rang suddenly, sharp and startling. He stared at it. No one called anymore except telemarketers and the VA clinic. He let it ring. It stopped. Then started again. Curiosity finally overpowered caution and he picked it up. Hello. Silence for a second, then a soft voice. Hi, Dad. Frankie froze. Emily. Her voice was older, more brittle, but unmistakably hers. His throat closed up. Emily. She hesitated. I saw a video. Some guy posted a clip of a car frame in your garage. Said an old man was building a Tesla. Frankie blinked. That kid, Dylan, he posted that. Emily exhaled. I wasn't sure it was you. But I saw the Miller Garage decal on the wall. That old red toolbox. Frankie didn't know what to say. So he said what came out. It's nothing big. Just, trying something. Why now? She asked. It's been 12 years. He leaned back, pressing his fingers to his temple. I don't know. I guess I remembered I used to be someone. You still are. That hit harder than he expected. He rubbed his eyes. You don't have to say that. I want to. Silence again. But this time, it wasn't sharp. It was heavy. Weighted with years. With unspoken things. Frankie took a breath. I'm sorry, Emily. For everything. For walking out after the accident. For shutting you out. For not knowing how to grieve without burning everything down. Her voice cracked. I wanted to come back. So many times. But I didn't know if you wanted me. I did, he said, voice raw. I just didn't know how to show it. They stayed on the line for a long time after that. No need to fill the air. Just knowing someone was there, breathing on the other end, was enough. After she hung up, promising to call again next week, Frankie sat there staring at the blank TV screen. His reflection looked old. Wrinkled. But there was something new in his eyes. Or maybe something old returning. He got up, walked back into the garage, and stood in front of the Tesla frame. It still looked like a wreck. But now it looked like a promise too. He touched the hood gently. She called, he whispered. The silence didn't answer back this time. Instead, a breeze rolled in through the open door, carrying the scent of motor oil and possibility. He looked at the workbench. The tools were still there, waiting. So was the road. The diner smelled like burnt toast, bleach, and old coffee. Frankie pushed the door open, the bell above jangling with a shrill note that cut through the mid-morning murmur. A few heads turned, then quickly turned back. Same old faces. Same booth in the back. Same laminated menu with the specials section that hadn't changed since Clinton was in office. He shuffled to the counter, nodded at the waitress, Pam, maybe Patty, he couldn't remember anymore. And sat on the squeaky red stool closest to the napkin dispenser. She poured him coffee without asking, the way people do when they've already written your whole story in their heads. You want the usual, Mr. Miller? He blinked at her, then nodded. Sure. She smiled politely, then moved down the counter to take an order from a teenager scrolling on his phone. Frankie wrapped both hands around the mug. It was hot, bitter, and lifeless, like it had been brewed 3 hours ago and reheated out of habit. He looked around. The jukebox in the corner was covered in dust. The front window had a new crack snaking through the bottom edge. 2 booths away, old man Harold played solitaire with creased cards, muttering under his breath. At the table by the door, a couple of younger guys in branded hoodies laughed about something on a tablet. Frankie caught a glimpse of the screen, some kind of electric truck with doors that opened like wings. He watched them laugh, tap, scroll, swipe. Then one of them said it, too loud, too fast, too carelessly. "You see that Plaid run? 0 to 60 in 1.9 seconds. Insane. Old cars don't stand a chance. Whole industry's done." Frankie felt something twist in his chest. Not anger. Not jealousy. Something older. Something duller. Like being erased in real time. The woman behind the counter brought over his eggs, dry toast, and a thin slice of ham that looked like it regretted being cooked. He nodded his thanks, then stared at the plate. No appetite. Just habit. He used to come here every Saturday with Mary. Same booth, same meal, same bad coffee. They'd talk about the garage, about Emily, about summer plans. Sometimes they just sat in silence, her hand on his, her eyes watching the rain streak down the window. Those mornings felt like lifetimes ago now. Frankie picked at the toast. The bell above the door rang again. A woman walked in pushing a stroller. The hostess, a girl barely old enough to rent a car, smiled at her and said, "Two?" The woman laughed. "Well, 1.5. The hostess nodded. "Right this way, ma'am." "Ma'am." Frankie stared down at his hands, calloused, veined, slow. When had the world started calling him, sir, with that tone? That quiet, distant tone that says, "We see you, but only barely." He ate in silence, finished half the toast, paid in cash, and left a tip more out of guilt than generosity. Outside, the air was warm but lazy, the sky a dull gray smear. Across the street, a shiny white Tesla coasted to a stop at the light, completely silent. No rumble, no vibration. Just motion. Like a ghost. Frankie watched it roll by, the driver staring ahead, not seeing him. He turned and walked down Main Street, passing shuttered storefronts and yoga studios and vape shops and a bakery with pink cursive writing on the window. The building that used to house Miller's garage was now Cloud9 Vapes and Lounge. The red brick facade was still the same, but the bay doors were gone, replaced by frosted glass windows with neon lights. Inside, kids in backward caps sat on leather couches blowing clouds into the air and laughing at their phones. Frankie stood across the street for a long minute. He could still picture the layout inside. 2 lifts in the back. Tool wall to the left. Office up front, where Mary would bring him lunch on busy days. He remembered the sounds, clanging wrenches, roaring engines, the creak of the roll-up doors, the smell of oil and rubber and hot metal. All of it gone now. Replaced by flavored smoke and Bluetooth speakers. He turned away. Walked back to his truck, a 92 F-150 that ran on spite and rust, and sat behind the wheel without turning the key. He stared through the windshield, gripping the steering wheel like it might offer him answers. He'd given everything to that garage. Built it from the ground up. Stayed late, came early, fixed cars for free when folks couldn't afford it. People used to bring him pie, whiskey, handshakes, and thanks. Now they brought their Teslas to dealerships and got diagnostics read by tablets. Mechanics were disappearing. Like drive-ins. Like phone booths. Like him. That night, the wind picked up, blowing dry leaves across the driveway. Frankie sat in the garage again, staring at the Tesla frame he'd hauled back from Fort Wayne. The metal still smelled like fire. He touched the side panel, fingertips grazing the dull finish. "You ever feel useless?" he asked the car, his voice thin in the night air. The car didn't answer, of course. But it didn't turn away either. He sat down on the milk crate he'd used as a stool for years and pulled out the notebook again. The page labeled "Retrofit Plan" stared back at him. Numbers. Diagrams. Notes in Mary's handwriting, let me know when I can help. He smiled at that. She'd always believed in him, even when he didn't. He flipped the page and jotted a new line, goal, build something that scares people. In a good way. He heard Elon's voice in his head again. You have to challenge the impossible. If you're not being laughed at, you're not dreaming big enough. Frankie chuckled. Well, they're laughing, all right. He stood up, moved to the back shelf, and pulled out an old tool chest. The hinges squealed in protest. Inside were parts he'd been saving. Some carb bits, old timing chains, a few universal joints that looked almost new. Nothing compatible with an EV. But maybe there was a way to blend them. A bridge. Like the one he needed with Emily. Something that respected the past but leaned into the future. The sound of footsteps interrupted his thoughts. He turned to see Dylan standing in the open doorway, hoodie pulled tight, hands in his pockets. Hey, the boy said. You still working on that thing? Frankie nodded. Most people build model trains. I guess I'm building a midlife crisis. Dylan grinned. Midlife? You planning to live to 140? Frankie laughed. A real laugh. Rusty, but real. That's the plan. Dylan stepped closer. I told my friends about you. They didn't believe it. Said there's no way some old guy is building a Plaid mod in his garage. Some old guy? Frankie raised an eyebrow. I'll have you know I was once considered dangerously cool. Yeah. When? The Nixon years. Frankie tossed a rag at him, and Dylan ducked. Fair enough, Frankie said. You ever pull a drive unit? No. But I know the basics. Frankie nodded toward the Tesla. Want to learn? Dylan stepped forward, eyes wide. Hell yeah. Frankie watched him for a moment. The kid moved fast. Asked smart questions. Listened. Frankie didn't say it, but something stirred in his chest. Not pride. Not yet. But hope, maybe. Possibility. The two of them worked under the garage lights until well past midnight. Tools clinked. Ideas sparked. Somewhere in the back of his mind, Frankie felt something he hadn't felt in years, like he mattered. Like he used to. Like maybe he still could. When Dylan finally left, Frankie stood alone in the garage again. But it didn't feel empty. Not this time. He looked at the car, then at his hands, then at the night sky stretching out beyond the open door. Used to be somebody, he thought. Maybe still am. It hit him in the middle of tightening a bolt, one of those moments that crept up uninvited, like the smell of winter in the middle of fall, cold and sharp and unwanted. Frankie had the drive unit suspended and was checking the torque specs when his elbow locked up, stiff and seizing like a rusty hinge, and he dropped the wrench. The clatter echoed through the garage like a gunshot. He stood there, hands on his knees, heart thumping too fast, sweat dripping into his eyes. He waited for the pain to pass, and when it didn't, he cursed under his breath, leaned on the workbench, and stared at the half-assembled Tesla frame with something close to resentment. Why bother, he muttered. The words came out louder than he intended, bouncing off the walls like an accusation. He could hear the voice in his head, low and cruel, the same one that showed up at night, when the house was quiet and the stairs seemed steeper than they used to. You're 71, Frank. Nobody cares if you finish this. You don't even know what you're building it for. The kid? A Facebook video? Your daughter who hasn't hugged you since 2011. He grabbed the wrench again, forced his elbow to move, gritted through the ache, and went back to work, but the thought had already sunk its teeth in. Why bother? It was the question that lived in the bones of every man who used to be strong and sharp and necessary and now found himself overlooked by touchscreen kiosks and self-checkout lines and tech that moved faster than his body ever could. He knew guys who gave up. Played golf. Watched the same news channel for 6 hours a day. Talked about the past like it was a museum, not a map. He told himself he was different. But the voice never stopped. Not really. The next morning, he found himself moving slower, not just because of the pain but because of the doubt. He sat at the kitchen table, the #OneDad mug in front of him, full of lukewarm coffee he didn't really want. He opened his notebook. The retrofit plan stared back, crisp lines, neat sketches, the kind of clarity he used to be proud of. He flipped the page and saw one word scrawled in his own handwriting from the night before: purpose. A question, not a mission. He closed the notebook and sighed. Outside, the wind was picking up again, scattering leaves across the front porch, rattling the screen door. He watched the tree in the yard sway gently, the same tree he'd planted with Mary the year Emily was born. It was taller now. Wider. Still standing. He reached for his phone, hesitated, then scrolled to Emily's number. He hadn't spoken to her again since the call. Not because she'd gone silent, but because he had. Afraid he'd say the wrong thing. Afraid he'd expect too much. Afraid the silence would return if he pushed too hard. He thought of her voice. "You still are," she'd said. He wanted to believe it. He wanted it to mean something. But belief was a fragile thing, and time had a way of eroding even the strongest foundations. He pocketed the phone and went back to the garage. Dylan wasn't coming that day, he had school, a test or something, and the place felt bigger without him. Quieter. He stared at the Tesla's exposed underbelly, the twisted cables, the cracked casing he hadn't found a replacement for yet. The frame looked skeletal, like something ancient and half-dead. "What am I doing?" he asked the car. It didn't answer. Just sat there like a mirror. He worked anyway. Slowly. Deliberately. One bolt at a time. One wire at a time. One memory at a time. In the afternoon, he drove to the junkyard again, not for parts but for clarity. There was something about the rust, the wreckage, the abandoned pieces of ambition that made him feel less alone. He walked the rows like a man visiting old friends, touching hoods, lifting tarps, running fingers over broken fenders. He came across a beat-up Chevelle with a note taped to the windshield: "Not for sale, restoration in progress." He smiled at that. Someone else was trying, too. On the drive home, he stopped at a gas station for a coffee and saw a group of teenagers outside taking selfies with a cherry-red Mustang Mach-E. One of them said, "This baby drives itself." Frankie shook his head and got back in his truck. He didn't want a car that drove itself. He wanted something that demanded his hands, his mind, his effort. Something that reminded him he still had value. That night, after 2 hours of staring at the ceiling in bed, he went back out to the garage. The wind was louder now, rattling the garage door like it was trying to get in. He turned on the radio, an old AM unit that barely picked up anything anymore, and let it hum static in the background. He pulled out his notebook again and wrote, "Reason, I miss feeling useful." Then another line, "Reason, I need to finish something." Then a third, "Reason, Emily needs to know I'm still here." He didn't cry. Not really. But his eyes stayed wet longer than usual. He wiped them on his sleeve and got to work. The battery casing had been giving him trouble for days. He'd finally figured out a workaround using an old mounting bracket from a Dodge Durango and some rubber grommets he'd forgotten he even had. He installed it with care, fingers steady, brain firing like it used to. At 3:12 a.m., he stepped back and stared at what he'd done. It didn't look like much to anyone else. But to him, it was progress. It was a win. It was a middle finger to the voice that asked, "Why bother?" As the sun rose behind the horizon, casting a dull gold light over the garage floor, Frankie took a photo with his flip phone and sent it to Emily. No caption. Just the photo. Just proof. 10 minutes later, she responded with a single sentence. "You're amazing." That was enough. Maybe not forever. Maybe not for everyone. But for now, it was enough. He turned off the radio, wiped his hands, and whispered into the silence, "That's why." The sound came back before the feeling did. A faint click, followed by the soft whine of voltage bleeding through wire, a frequency too thin for young ears but unmistakable to someone like Frankie who had spent half his life listening to machines breathe. He stepped back slowly, breath held, eyes locked on the narrow strip of LED he'd wired into the side panel of the modified Tesla drive unit. For a moment, nothing. Then, like a match finally catching the edge of damp kindling, the light pulsed, a dim heartbeat in the bones of the machine. Frankie let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding and chuckled quietly to himself, hands trembling, not from age this time, but adrenaline. He leaned in and touched the housing gently, as if it were a sleeping animal. It had taken 4 days, 6 failed attempts, and a wiring diagram from a forum so obscure he wasn't sure if it was legal, but it worked. The power ran clean now. No sparks, no warning beeps, no error codes. Just life. Electricity in motion. That quiet whisper of, yes, that only old engineers still believed in. He reached for his phone, forgetting it wasn't a smartphone, and settled instead for a quick scribble in the notebook, mainline connected. Pulse confirmed. We are officially online. Then, below that, progress is a kind of prayer. He smiled at the line. Mary would have liked that one. The sun was just beginning to rise when he stepped out of the garage, a mug of yesterday's coffee in one hand and the other bracing his sore back. The neighborhood was still asleep, except for the Jenkins kid who jogged past in neon shorts and wireless earbuds, oblivious to the historic miracle taking place in the old man's garage. Frankie sipped the coffee. Still bitter. Still bad. Still perfect. Inside the house, the air felt lighter. Not because anything had changed, but because something finally had. He moved with more intention, as if every room he walked through mattered again. The kitchen wasn't just a place to survive breakfast. It was where he planned the next steps. The living room wasn't just a resting place for tired legs. It was where he sketched motor housing modifications during commercial breaks. Even the hallway, the narrow stretch of carpet leading to Mary's old sewing room, felt like it held possibilities instead of memories. That night, he didn't watch TV. Instead, he took the photo Emily had texted him months ago, her and her son, Max, at a science museum somewhere in Oregon, and pinned it above the workbench. It had been buried in his drawer under insurance forms and VA paperwork. Max looked about 10, all arms and legs, with a smile that reminded Frankie of Emily at that age. Big eyes. Curious. Unafraid. He whispered to the photo, "Maybe you'll ride in this thing one day, kid." And for the first time, it didn't sound like a joke. It sounded like a goal. The next day, Dylan came by after school carrying a tattered backpack and an energy drink that looked like it belonged in a radioactive waste bin. "What's up, Professor Frankenstein?" the kid grinned, stepping into the garage like he lived there. Frankie pointed at the newly wired frame. "She's got a pulse." Dylan's eyebrows shot up. "No way. You powered the core?" Frankie handed him the voltmeter. "Check for yourself." Dylan leaned over the chassis, his fingers moving fast. When the numbers flashed green, he let out a low whistle. "Dude. That's clean. That's like Elon level clean." Frankie shrugged, but the compliment lit something in him. "It's a start." They worked until dark, elbows deep in cables, arguing about torque specs and debating the benefits of regenerative braking modules. Frankie let the kid talk, correcting him when needed but giving space when the passion kicked in. There was something beautiful about watching someone learn in real time, like watching an engine come alive for the first time after years in the dark. They ordered pizza, greasy and perfect, and ate it on the tailgate of Frankie's truck, looking out at the quiet street. Why were you doing this, really? Dylan asked between bites. Frankie chewed slowly, swallowed. Because I forgot I still could. Dylan nodded like he understood, even if he didn't. It's gonna be insane when it's done. I mean, a plaid mod in a homemade frame. That's legend status. Frankie smirked. Only if it works. Dylan finished his slice, licked the grease from his fingers, and said, "It's already working. You got people talking. You got me talking." Frankie didn't say anything, but inside, something warm shifted. That night, he called Emily again. She picked up on the second ring. "Hey, Dad." Her voice was brighter this time. Less guarded. "Hey," he replied. "Just wanted to say. I powered it up." "Seriously?" She said, surprised. "You got the drive system online?" He chuckled. "Not fully. But she's breathing." A pause. "That's incredible. I want you to see it sometime," he said, the words thick in his throat. "Both of you. You and Max." Another pause. Then a softer voice. "He'd love that. He's obsessed with anything fast." "Good," Frankie said. "Because this thing's gonna fly." They talked for 15 more minutes, about her job, Max's soccer team, Oregon rain. Frankie didn't mention the pain in his elbow, or how long it took him to get down the stairs that morning. He didn't want to be seen as broken. Not anymore. After the call, he stood in front of the Tesla frame again, hands in his pockets, the hum of power faint but steady. The spark was back, not just in the machine, but in him. Not loud. Not flashy. Just real. He'd spent years convincing himself that usefulness expired with youth, that reinvention was a privilege for the young, that dreams had deadlines. But now, as the autumn wind whispered through the cracked garage windows and the soft glow of a low-voltage LED blinked steadily beside the motor housing, he realized how wrong that thinking had been. He didn't need to be fast. He didn't need to be famous. He just needed to be in motion. To matter. To try. He ran a hand along the curve of the chassis, eyes tracing every weld, every bolt, every scar. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't even close. But it was his. Built with memory and regret and stubbornness and hope. The kind of hope that grows slow and strong, like roots in dry ground. The next morning, he didn't sleep in. He didn't drag himself from bed or sigh at the bathroom mirror. He got up with purpose. The aches were still there. The stiffness, the slowness. But they weren't the loudest thing in the room anymore. The loudest thing was the drive. The work. The goal. The fire. He poured the coffee, took a sip, made a face, and smiled. "Let's get to it," he said to no one in particular, then stepped into the garage, where the spark was still waiting. The first time someone called him Frankie again, really called him that, with weight and memory in the tone, was on a Thursday at the hardware store. He was standing in aisle 7 with a box of hex bolts under one arm and a socket wrench he didn't need but missed holding in his hand when he heard it from the other end of the aisle, like a name being pulled out of retirement. Frankie Miller. The voice was raspy, familiar, but older, like someone trying on their old voice after decades of silence. Frankie turned slowly, cautious, squinting through the harsh overhead light, and then blinked as the face came into focus. Walt Hansen. Used to work at the tire shop across from Miller's garage back in the 80s. Thinner now. Wrinkles cut deep across his face like someone had carved time into him with a knife. But those eyes, green and sharp, same old Walt. "Walt?" Frankie said, stunned. "I'll be damned." They laughed in that half-choked way that men do when they're not used to showing emotion. They shook hands, firm and quick, and Walt clapped him on the shoulder like they were still standing over carburetors in the summer heat of 1985. "You still alive, huh?" Walt said. Word is, you're building something wild in that dusty old garage of yours. Frankie raised an eyebrow. News travels that fast? You kidding? This town's got 3 hobbies now: walking dogs, complaining about property taxes, and guessing what Frankie Miller's doing with a broken Tesla frame. Frankie laughed, really laughed, and it came from a part of him he'd almost forgotten existed. The part that used to joke with customers and give advice to rookie mechanics and sit on the tailgate after a long day with grease on his shirt and pride in his bones. Well, I guess the rumors are true, Frankie said. It's a project car. Kind of a Frankenstein job. Walt smirked. Always did like impossible stuff. You remember that time you tried to convert that '68 Vet to run on propane? Don't remind me, Frankie groaned. Mary made me sleep in the guest room for a week after I filled the house with fumes. They talked like that for 10 minutes, then 20, standing there among the shelves of screws and fittings, 2 relics surrounded by new products and synthetic solutions. And for the first time in years, Frankie didn't feel invisible in a store. He felt seen. Known. Relevant. Walt finally said, "If you ever need an extra hand, I still know my way around a wiring harness." Frankie gave him a nod. "I might just take you up on that." When he walked out of the store, the sun was a little brighter. The wind didn't bite as hard. He climbed into the F-150 and sat there for a second, gripping the wheel, thinking about how the past wasn't dead, it just needed a reason to show up again. Back in the garage, he moved with a different kind of rhythm. Not fast. Not young. But confident. Like a man with a purpose instead of a hobby. The drive unit was fully installed now, and he'd started work on the suspension, repurposing components from a wrecked Model 3 and a pair of custom shocks he'd ordered off a forum that didn't allow usernames, just VIN numbers. Dylan showed up an hour later, whistling through his teeth, hoodie half-zipped, backpack slung over one shoulder. "Yo, you're making progress," the kid said, setting his stuff down and circling the frame like a mechanic on a pit crew. "You actually got it mounted. How the hell did you balance the torque weight?" Frankie handed him the notebook, flipping to the sketch with the hand-labeled load calculations. Calculated the sweet spot, shifted the cradle 2 inches forward, then added a crossbeam under the rear axle. Dylan blinked. "Dude. That's brilliant." Frankie gave a small shrug. "You learn a few things after 40 years of doing it the hard way." They worked all afternoon, and by the time dusk rolled in, the frame had started to look like a car again. Still skeleton, still raw, but it had structure. It had intent. After Dylan left, promising to bring over a 3D printed part he designed at school, Frankie stood in the garage alone, wiping sweat from his brow with a rag that hadn't seen the inside of a washing machine in months. He looked down at his hands, dirty, stiff, sore, and flexed them slowly. Not done yet, he thought. That evening, he took out a photo album he hadn't opened in years. Sat on the couch with it in his lap, the lamplight catching the edges of the worn plastic sleeves. Page after page of Mary. Emily. The garage in its heyday. Frankie in overalls, covered in grime, holding up engine parts like trophies. One photo stopped him cold, Emily at age 16, standing next to a stripped-down Chevy she'd helped him rebuild one summer. Her ponytail messy, her hands stained with grease, but her smile so wide it hurt to look at. He remembered that summer. How she asked questions he didn't know how to answer. How proud she looked when they started the engine for the first time. How he told her, "You've got the touch," and meant it. Somewhere after that, it all drifted. Work got harder. Mary got sick. The arguments with Emily got louder. Choices got made. The silence took root. He pressed his fingers to the photo. "I was a better version of me back then," he whispered. "I want that version back." He stayed there for a long time, holding on to the memory not like a weight but like a handle, something to lift himself up with. The next morning, something strange happened. He caught his reflection in the mirror and paused. He didn't look younger. But he looked upright. His shoulders were pulled back. His jaw set firmer. The bags under his eyes were still there, but they sat beneath eyes that had purpose again. He nodded once at the mirror. "Welcome back," he said. At the diner later that week, he walked in and didn't sit at the counter like usual. He slid into a booth by the window. Patty, he finally remembered her name, brought over his coffee with a curious smile. "You're looking different these days, Mr. Miller." "Maybe I am," he said, and meant it. Across the room, one of the hoodie kids from before leaned over and whispered to a friend, pointing subtly in Frankie's direction. This time, Frankie didn't feel erased. He felt noticed. Not in the way young people crave fame, but in the way old people crave recognition, that someone sees you, knows you have a story, believes you're still writing it. He finished his coffee, left a bigger tip than usual, and walked out into the crisp morning with a little more speed in his step. That night, he called Emily again. She answered on speaker, Max in the background shouting about some video game. "Guess what?" Frankie said, voice steady. "Got the motor frame done." "Seriously?" she said, impressed. "I thought that would take weeks." "It did. But I used some tricks from the Mustang rebuild in '99. Cross-braced the frame." "I remember that car," Emily said, laughing. "Mom said it was your second wife." She wasn't wrong. Then, after a pause, "Max wants to talk to you." The voice on the other end shifted. "Hi, Grandpa." The word hit Frankie like a wrench to the ribs, but in a good way. "Hey, Max. Your mom tells me you like fast things." "I love fast things," Max said. "I want to build a rocket." "Then you're going to love what I'm building," Frankie said. "Can I see it?" "Not yet," Frankie said, smiling. "But soon." That night, he worked in the garage until 2 a.m. again, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. He played old rock records. He sang quietly. He talked to the car. The man who used to own Miller's garage was back, not all the way, not yet, but enough that the town had started whispering. Enough that the wind through the open door didn't sound like loneliness anymore. It sounded like movement. Like something returning. Like the spark had caught fire. And Frankie, covered in grease, lit by the golden hum of headlamps he hadn't installed yet, smiled at the growing shape in front of him and said, "There you are." It was always the little things that blindsided you. Frankie thought he'd accounted for the major hurdles, the frame alignment, the battery wiring, the cross-beam torque compensation. But late one night, as he and Dylan were running diagnostics, they heard it, the sound of something grinding inside the drive unit. Not a healthy hum, but a choked, wheezing groan that made Frankie's chest tighten. He froze mid-adjustment, the wrench in his hands suddenly heavy. Dylan's eyes went wide. "You hear that?" The kid's voice was quiet, cautious. Frankie nodded. He pulled back the shroud to reveal a gear misaligned by just a millimeter, enough to bind under pressure. He hadn't seen it in the sketches, hadn't felt it in the holdup, but it was there, whispering failure. He gently touched the gear, fingertips gritty with grease. "We misjudged the load," he said, voice low. "It's pulling the drive unit off balance." Panic surged like a spike. Imagine building your second chance and watching it unravel in a metal click. He closed his eyes and inhaled, trying to steady his breath. The garage felt smaller. The world outside quiet. Outside, mainstream society didn't value broken parts. It valued sleek, perfect products sliding off assembly lines, not dusty garages patching together sparks and scraped knuckles. But this wasn't about society. It was about reassembling a soul. Dropping the drive unit carefully to the stand, he grabbed the notebook and penciled in a note, "Gear clearance off, realign or replace." Then, pain equals learning curve. Dylan watched him, a mix of concern and excitement in his eyes. Because even though they'd run into a wall, the wall had shown them something, how high they could still reach. Over the next 2 days, Frankie ordered a replacement gear assembly and drew up reinforcement brackets to hold everything tighter. His elbow protested every move. His hands shook by the end of the day. But each bolt tightened was a quiet victory. Each measurement recalculated was a challenge met. Yet the misalignment had rattled him. In the morning, he sat at the kitchen table, the sputtering coffee maker pumping out lifeless sludge, and stared at the notebook, its pages filled with hope, but now stained with doubt. He revisited quotes he'd copied about Elon Musk. Some people don't like change, but you need to embrace change if the alternative is disaster. The words echoed in his mind with renewed relevance. Embrace the trial, he thought. When something's important enough, you do it even if the odds are against you. That's why he was here. That's why he hadn't stopped. Later, in the garage, the replacement gear arrived. It looked clean and precise, a promise in metal. He and Dylan gently fitted it into place, carefully aligning the teeth. Sparks flared when they tested rotation. The sound this time wasn't a gasp, it was a smooth note of possibility. Frankie exhaled, hands shaking, more from relief than fatigue. "She's singing again," he whispered. Dylan grinned. "Sorry, I'm a sap," the kid said. "But I'm proud of you." Frankie nodded. Some battles are internal, louder than any engine noise. They worked until late, rechecking torque specs, rebalancing the system. At 2 a.m., they finally shut off the lights. The drive unit hummed on its stand, steady. Fueled by oil and determination. Days later, he called Emily. There was noise in the garage, hints of something bound again, not perfect but mendable. "We hit a snag," he told her. "Had a misaligned gear." She was quiet. "But we fixed it." Her voice softened. "That's what counts." They talked for a long time after that, not just about parts, but about memories, regrets, and the idea that fixing things isn't just about tools. It's about heart. A few nights later, as the drive unit ran through diagnostics, the engine simulator measured output, and then jumped. Numbers spiked higher than before. A glitch? Frankie stared. Dylan flipped switches. The values held. The torque ratcheted up. That millimeter correction had unlocked performance. Frankie almost grinned. It wasn't a full run, but it was a hint, a preview of what might come. His hands burned with pain. His back groaned in protest. But inside, something sparked that felt like pride, not over the numbers, but over perseverance. The next morning, at the diner, he slid onto the red stool again, but this time with a quiet assurance. "How's the racer coming?" Pam asked, cup hovering near empty. "Better," he said. "Almost running." She smiled. That word, racer, felt good in his mouth. On the way back to the garage, he stopped at the photo album again, looking at Emily's teenage face. A thought surfaced, small and steady. Maybe this chapter wasn't about winning. It was about trying. About being tested and still moving. That evening, he and Dylan tested a mock run, cautious, deliberate. The motor spun, wheels turned. Nothing extravagant, but motion. Grace notes after the staccato of problems. Frankie felt it in his chest. Good pain. Honest progress. He leaned against the workbench, closed his eyes, and thought, I may be old, but I still build. I still learn. I still push. A short burst of clicks outside the open garage door. It was Emily, holding Max's hand, framed by the streetlight. She stepped in quietly, watching. Frankie opened his eyes and saw her in the warm garage light, dusty and hopeful. He nodded. She smiled. Dylan gave a thumbs up. The drive unit stopped, wires humming. Frankie walked to the garage door. You two want to hear something? He pointed to the chassis. It's alive again. Emily's eyes glistened. Max hopped forward. Can I touch it? Without waiting, Frankie grabbed Max's hand and guided it to the frame, careful, respectful, alive. He felt a weight lift. The hum was low, but powerful. Like a heartbeat. Routes mapped back to life. The misalignment, the grind, the fix, they formed a story. Not about speed, but persistence. Not about perfection, but intention. That night, he wrote in the notebook, troubles break you or build you. Chose to be built. Next day, he opened the garage early, wearing jeans, shirt stained with grease, eyes bright. He was back. Not because he hadn't been tested, but because he survived the test. And sometimes, that's the greatest gear shift of all. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Frankie had never been one for big speeches or grandstanding. He believed in work, quiet, consistent, grease under the fingernails work. But something had shifted. Not just in him, but around him. People were noticing. Not crowds, not media vans, but real people, neighbors, passers-by, old friends who hadn't dropped by in years. They peeked into his garage as they walked their dogs or pushed strollers or rode their bikes past, giving little waves or slow head nods. One guy on a bicycle stopped completely, leaned on the handlebar, and just said, "You really doing it?" Frankie wiped his hands on a rag and nodded. Little by little. The man smiled, shook his head like he couldn't believe it, and pedaled off, calling over his shoulder, "Keep going, brother." That stuck with him. Keep going. Not, "Good luck," or, "You're crazy." Just, "Keep going." A statement that assumed forward motion. A belief, unspoken, that what he was doing mattered, even if no one really understood it. He began to feel like something bigger than just a man fixing a machine. He was repairing something else too, faith maybe. In second chances. In what people like him, people who felt discarded or past their prime, could still do. Emily noticed it when she brought Max over again a few days later. The boy beelined for the workbench like it was Disneyland. "Can I help?" he asked, eyes wide. Frankie hesitated for a second, wires everywhere, tools laid out in a very particular way, but then he nodded. "Here," he said, handing him a small wrench. "We're tightening the support brackets. Think you can handle that?" Max grinned like he'd been handed a space suit. Emily stood in the doorway, arms folded, watching with a soft smile. She didn't say much, but her eyes said everything. Frankie had seen her look at him with concern, resentment, even pity over the years. But this was something else. Respect, maybe. Or something closer to peace. Over the next week, the project accelerated. Not because Frankie was working faster, his body still had limits, but because everything started flowing. The process that had felt like pushing a boulder uphill now felt like momentum. Like gravity had shifted in his favor. Dylan was showing up early. Max came by after school twice. Walt stopped in with coffee and a few stories about their old racing days. Frankie found himself telling more jokes, laughing more easily, even humming under his breath. The car itself was finally starting to look like something real. The chassis was solid. The drive unit synced properly. The steering system, which had given them fits for days, finally stabilized after Dylan came up with a clever mounting solution that Frankie never would have thought of on his own. He told the kid as much, and Dylan lit up like a Christmas tree. "You're really doing this," Emily said one night after dinner, as they stood side by side in the garage. "I didn't think, well, I wasn't sure either," Frankie said. "Not at first." She looked at him, softer now. "I've been telling people at work. About what you're doing. They're kind of amazed. Frankie chuckled. At an old man building a car in his garage. At an old man refusing to stay parked, she replied. That hit him in the chest. Not in a painful way, but like a tuning fork finally ringing in pitch. That night, after everyone had gone home, he stood in the garage alone. The wind rattled against the siding. A light bulb flickered once and went steady. He walked slowly around the car, touching the frame, the seat, the paneling. Not much of the original Tesla remained now. It was more like a hybrid, part electric beast, part mechanical memoir. Every bolt told a story. Every wire was a choice. He looked down at his hands, still rough, still stiff, and thought, you're not done yet. You're becoming something again. The next morning, he got a message from a former customer, someone who used to bring their Ford F-150 to his shop back when people still had landlines. Heard what you're building. Would love to stop by. Frankie texted back, garages open. Always. The guy came with his teenage daughter, who had dreams of becoming an engineer. She asked questions. He answered. She scribbled notes. At one point, she said, I thought electric cars were boring until I saw this. Frankie smiled. Electric's just a different kind of fire. The line stuck. She asked if she could come back sometime. He said of course. Dylan looked over later that night as they installed the control unit. You're kind of becoming a legend, you know that? A legend? Frankie snorted. Please. I'm serious, Dylan said. People talk about you like you're Tony Stark or something. But, like, old school. Old's the only school I've got, Frankie muttered. But deep down, he felt it too. Not fame. Not ego. But purpose. Like he was living in a way that made other people look up instead of looking past. Momentum wasn't about speed. It was about weight. About moving forward with history behind you, not dragging you. About waking up and wanting to build instead of just survive. He started keeping a little journal. Just a few sentences every night. What they worked on. What went wrong. What surprised him. On one page he wrote, the thing about forward motion is it doesn't ask your age. It just asks your effort. On another, started as a project. Became a mirror. Now it's a voice. Then, in all caps, still useful. Still building. On Saturday, he and Dylan took the frame out into the driveway. Carefully. Slowly. It was the first time it had touched sunlight in nearly 6 months. A couple of neighbors clapped as they passed by. One old woman across the street cried. Reminds me of my Harold, she said. He used to tinker too. Frankie smiled and tipped his cap. The car gleamed, not because it was polished, but because it was proud. Imperfect and proud. Like him. He turned to Dylan. Think it'll run by October? Dylan grinned. It'll fly. That night, Frankie watched an old clip of Elon Musk talking about risk, about how starting SpaceX could have bankrupted him, how people called him insane, how he just kept moving forward because the mission mattered more than the fear. Frankie watched the clip twice. Then once more. The man had billions, yes. But what he really had, what Frankie connected with, was that refusal to stop just because the world didn't get it. That belief that something better was possible, even when everyone else laughed. Maybe he wasn't building a spaceship. But to Frankie, this car was his Falcon Heavy. A launch pad back into life. A message to the world, hell, to himself, that age wasn't a death sentence. It was just another chapter. The garage lights hummed above him. The car stood still, but no longer silent. And in the quiet, Frankie whispered, let's keep going. Frankie stood at the starting line of his driveway like it was Le Mans, heart thumping, the engine, if you could still call that silent hum an engine, buzzing like a living thing beneath him. The chassis, built on old dreams and new courage, sat on jacks at first light, waiting for its moment. Around him stood Dylan, wide-eyed and grinning, Emily, arms crossed but with a glint in her eye, Max, bouncing on his toes, even Walt leaning against the garage doorframe, nodding like he'd just witnessed a miracle unveil. The street was quiet, early. Birds hadn't yet decided to start their day. It felt sacred, like the world was holding its breath to see if an old man still had one clean run left. Frankie briefed them all without theatrics. "This is about more than speed," he said, voice steady. "We're testing what's possible." He climbed in, the seat creaking under weight he once assumed was gravity, not memory. He flexed his fingers on the wheel, rough against smooth metal, and thought of a line he'd saved from an Elon Musk quote: "When something is important enough, even if the odds are not in your favor, you should still do it." That line was in his head now, in his bones. This ride was more than metal and wiring, it was proof. He counted down. 1, 2, 3. Pulled the switch. The drive unit responded with a soft whir, the wheels spun, and the car, his epic, cobbled-together beast, moved. First slowly, then smoother, as if it knew where it was going. Down the strip of driveway, past the old mailbox and the crooked tree he'd planted with Mary, where once a boy and his dad had thrown a twisted Excel together. The world didn't blur. The wind didn't rush in his face. But in that glide, his breath felt lighter. He let the clutch, or whatever passed for one, out, and it moved, not fast, but sure. At the end of the drive, he let it roll to a stop. Then he climbed out. The engine clicking down was a sound he'd forgotten was beautiful. Dylan slapped his shoulder. Emily nodded. Max cheered. Walt knocked a beer cap off his truck with a laugh. In that moment, age did not define him. The car did. And the car was moving. Later, they took it to the nearby road that led to the old drag strip. Unused now, just cracked asphalt and memories. At the entrance, the world held out its breath. Neighbors peeking behind hedges. A couple teens on bikes stopping to watch. No judgment. Just curiosity. Frankie gave them a nod and turned the key. The drive unit hummed, lights flickered on dash remnants. He eased the throttle. The car lurched forward. Not a rocket launch, but strong. Controlled. Alive. He reached the end of the strip and stopped. Under the afternoon sun, dust rising and birds scattering, he climbed down again. The silence beside the engine's faint hum felt like applause. Emily walked up. "I've never seen anything like this," she said, voice close to a whisper. Frankie looked at her. At Max. At Dylan. At Walt. And realized something took shape in his chest, something he thought had withered years ago. Pride, not the showy kind, but steady. Quiet. Pure. He opened the glove compartment where he'd stuck the notebook weeks ago. He pulled out a pen, not for schematics, but lines. The first step is to establish that something is possible, then probability will occur. That one felt right. Even Elon said that. And that had become true here, in this cracked strip of asphalt, in a patched-together electric frame. Frankie closed his eyes and let the words roll inside him. The ride proved everything. That night, Emily stayed. They sat around the tailgate with sliced pizza, quiet but full. Max fell asleep on the truck bed, Dylan at his side, half whispering about torque. Frankie looked at his daughter and whispered, "I was too stubborn to stop." She didn't say, "I know." Instead, she leaned her head on his shoulder, and that was enough. The next morning, they woke to news. A local blogger had posted a short clip, "The drive down the strip," with a caption, "72-year-old builds Plaid mod in garage, defies expectations." No viral fame, but some local shares. Someone wrote in a comment, "If he can do that at 72, what's stopping us?" Frankie checked the comment. He smiled. That was the legacy he wanted, the spark igniting others. In the following weeks, he refinished a few panels, hooked up rudimentary lights, tested braking systems, and figured out how to charge the unit again. Each step was slower than he liked, but every click was momentum. He kept writing in his journal, "Age didn't slow me. Belief in motion did." That evening, he found a video of Musk sharing how SpaceX had only a 10 to 20% chance of survival when starting out. Musk pressed on despite the odds. Frankie felt kinship. No billions, no rockets, but same fight. He wrote in the journal, "Odds low. Belief strong. That's enough." One morning, Walt brought a landscaping newspaper clipping, an ad for a local senior center. At the bottom, a note, "Auto tech class starting soon." Frankie stared. A dozen people his age, curious about electric cars. He looked at the car, dusty but dignified. "You think that old man could teach them a thing or two?" Walt asked. Frankie sighed, thought of Mary, of Emily, of the kid, of the ride. "Yeah," he said. "I think he can." Frankie had never imagined he'd be standing in front of a classroom again, especially not one full of people his age, eyes bright with curiosity and hands itching to learn something new. The senior center was a modest building on the edge of town, its walls echoing with decades of bingo nights and holiday dinners. But today, it was something else. It was a place where futures began, not ended. The first day of his autotech class wasn't packed, but it wasn't empty either. 10 people showed up. Some steady, some hesitant, all carrying their own stories of what "too old" had meant to them. Frankie looked at each face, some lined deep with age, some smiling shyly, others skeptical. He caught himself wondering if any of them believed in him the way he now believed in himself. He smiled and started with the truth, "We're here because we're not done. Because there's no expiration on learning, building, or dreaming." The room was quiet, but the weight of those words hung in the air like an invitation. He didn't waste time with fancy lessons. Instead, he showed them the Tesla Model S Plaid project, pointing out parts and explaining the basics of electric vehicles, the motors, the batteries, the controllers. He explained how he'd taken Elon Musk's idea of breaking boundaries to heart. He once said, "Some people don't like change, but you need to embrace change if the alternative is disaster." That's what we're doing here, choosing change over giving up. His students leaned in, some nodding, others asking questions that sparked more than just mechanical answers. They talked about fear, fear of failure, fear of irrelevance, fear of never feeling needed again. Frankie shared his own story, about the years he felt invisible, the days when he thought his best chapters were behind him. But here, with this group, something stirred. They weren't just listening, they were waking up. The weeks unfolded slowly but steadily. They took apart old lawnmowers to understand engines. They rebuilt batteries salvaged from discarded equipment. They learned how electric power could be clean, quiet, and powerful. Frankie marveled at their determination, at how the wrinkles on their hands told stories of hard work and resilience. On one chilly afternoon, a woman named Joan brought in a broken scooter. "It's my legs that fail me, but I refuse to stop moving," she said. Frankie looked at the scooter and smiled. "Let's get you moving again." Together, they tore it down, cleaned the parts, replaced the battery. When Joan took it for a spin, the smile on her face was as bright as any sunrise. Frankie felt a lump in his throat. This wasn't just about machines. It was about life. One evening, Emily joined the class. She watched her father guide the students, saw how his eyes lit up teaching instead of fixing cars alone in a garage. Afterward, she pulled him aside. "Dad, this is amazing. You've built something bigger than a car. You've built a community." Frankie nodded slowly. "I thought I was just repairing a car. Turns out, I was repairing myself." The connection between the students grew stronger. They started calling themselves the Plaid Pioneers, a nod to the car that had sparked their journey. They met after class to share stories, swap ideas, and dream aloud about building their own electric bikes, scooters, even small cars. Frankie often caught himself laughing more than he had in years. He wasn't just their teacher, he was their fellow builder, their teammate in a fight against time and doubt. Outside the classroom, word spread quietly. The local paper ran a small piece titled, "Senior Center Sparks Electric Hope." People stopped Frankie at the grocery store, complimenting his work, sharing their own stories of second chances. Even his daughter Emily, once distant, found herself drawn closer. One afternoon, she brought Max along to class. Watching her son engage with Frankie's students, asking questions about motors and batteries, she felt a swell of pride. "Looks like the spark is contagious," she whispered. Frankie smiled. It's never too late to ignite a flame. Months passed, and the car moved from the driveway to the streets of their small town. Not fast, not flashy, but steady and sure, a symbol of persistence and possibility. Frankie felt a quiet joy every time someone waved as he drove by, every time a child pointed and said, "Look, that's the electric car." On a cool spring morning, the Plaid Pioneers gathered in the senior center for their first exhibition. They displayed projects, electric bikes, battery packs, DIY charging stations. Frankie stood by the car, proud but humble. The room buzzed with excitement, families came to see the projects, neighbors marveled at what a group once told they were too old to change had built. Emily caught her father's eye and mouthed, "You did it." Frankie nodded. "We did it." That night, he sat alone with his journal, pen in hand, reflecting on the journey. He wrote, "We moved beyond the garage, beyond the limits set by fear and age. We built more than machines, we built hope." The quiet was interrupted by a message on his phone. It was a video from Elon Musk's official Twitter account, a retweet of a local news story about the Plaid Pioneers. Alongside it, Musk's caption, "Innovation has no age limit. Keep pushing." Frankie stared at the screen, heart pounding. That spark, the one he'd carried in his chest for months, now burned brighter than ever. He realized then that this was no longer just his story. It was everyone's. The journey wasn't over. It was just beginning. And for the first time in a long time, Frankie felt truly unstoppable. Frankie had thought that the hardest part was behind him. He had built a car, started a class, inspired a community. But as the Plaid Pioneers grew, so did the whispers. The skeptics emerged, not with shouts, but with quiet, cutting doubt. At the local diner, he overheard conversations, "What's the point? They're just old folks playing with toys." At the hardware store, a clerk glanced sideways when Frankie asked about new parts, as if to say, "Why bother at your age?" Even his own family voiced concern. Emily, protective as ever, worried about his health, about the wear and tear of pushing too hard. "Dad, you don't have to prove anything to anyone," she said one evening, voice low but firm. Frankie looked at her, understanding her fear but feeling it didn't apply. "I'm not proving them wrong, Em. I'm proving me right." The real challenge wasn't physical anymore, it was the weight of judgment. The unspoken assumption that after a certain age, a person should slow down, fade away, and settle into quiet irrelevance. The world had forgotten that people like Frankie still had fight left. Worse, sometimes he forgot too. Then came the letter. A formal note from the town council. It said the senior center's funding was at risk due to questionable programming and resource allocation. The implied message was clear: the Plaid Pioneers were an indulgence, a distraction from real, senior activities. Frankie felt the punch in his gut. The class, the community, the second chance, it was all under threat. But he remembered Elon Musk's words from a recent interview. "When something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor." BrainyQuote.com, this was his moment to lean into that truth. He gathered the Plaid Pioneers at the center, their faces a mix of worry and determination. They want us to stop. To give up. To be quiet. But we're not done yet. The room erupted in murmurs and nods. Together, they drafted letters, organized a community meeting, and planned a demonstration of what the class had achieved, showing the council that this was more than a hobby, it was a lifeline. At the hearing, Frankie stood before the council, heart pounding but voice steady. He told their stories, not just his, but Joan's journey from a broken scooter to independence, Max's bright eyes learning mechanics, Dylan's dreams sparked by a dusty old Tesla. He spoke of purpose found in unlikely places, of the power of learning and building at any age. Some council members looked unconvinced. Others, surprised. One elderly woman in the audience, a retired teacher, wiped away a tear. After the meeting, Frankie didn't expect a miracle. But a few days later, the council voted to continue funding, just enough to keep the class going. It wasn't a full victory, but it was a start. The fight had only just begun. Meanwhile, online comments on the news stories ranged from admiration to condescension. Some called them heroes, others dismissed them as desperate relics clinging to youth. Frankie learned to scroll past the noise, focusing on the messages that mattered, the thank you notes from students who felt alive again, the small donations from neighbors who believed. One evening, as he tuned the car's braking system, he found a letter slipped under the garage door. It was from an anonymous sender, simply reading, "Thank you for showing me it's never too late." He folded it carefully and put it in his journal. That simple note felt like a lifeline, a reminder that his fight was bigger than himself. At home, Emily sat beside him, her eyes softer than ever. "You're changing lives, Dad. Not just with that car, but with everything you're building." Frankie smiled, a mix of pride and fatigue. "I'm learning too. That fight doesn't get easier. You just get stronger." Walt dropped by one afternoon with a box of old magazines, car shows from the 70s and 80s. As they flipped through pictures of sleek engines and shiny chrome, Walt grinned. "You know, they all thought we were crazy back then too." Frankie laughed. History has a way of loving the stubborn. That stubbornness was exactly what kept Frankie going. Every critique, every doubt became fuel for the fire. Elon Musk's example wasn't just inspiration, it was a blueprint. Musk had faced failure after failure, ridicule and resistance, but his refusal to quit changed industries and minds. Frankie realized he was doing the same on a smaller scale, changing a town's perception, challenging the limits imposed on age and ability. One chilly evening, the Plaid pioneers gathered for a late workshop. The mood was fierce and hopeful. They planned a community electric vehicle show, inviting people from all over to see their projects and learn. Frankie stood at the center, looking at their eager faces and feeling a surge of gratitude. The critics hadn't won. Not yet. Not while this group stood united. The next day, he shared another Musk quote with them, "Persistence is very important. You should not give up unless you are forced to give up." It echoed in his mind as he wrote in his journal that night, "Critics will always be there. But the choice is ours, to listen or to move." Frankie closed the book and looked around his quiet garage. The car sat there, a testament to resilience, to rebellion against the idea that age means end. He touched the steering wheel and whispered, "We're just getting started." The road ahead was long, full of challenges, but Frankie was no longer afraid. He had become a beacon, a living proof that the journey doesn't stop when the world says it should. Inspired by Elon Musk, driven by his own unyielding will, Frankie was ready to face whatever came next. Because sometimes, the greatest ride is not on the road, but through the storms we dare to confront. The morning light streamed softly through the windows of the senior center, casting long shadows on the worn wooden floor where the Plaid pioneers gathered. The room buzzed with anticipation, a quiet electricity that pulsed beneath the steady rhythm of shuffling feet and whispered plans. Frankie looked around at the faces, some familiar, some new, but all united by a common purpose, to prove that age was no barrier to innovation, to reinvention, to change. He remembered a line from Elon Musk, spoken during a fiery interview: "Some people don't like change, but you need to embrace change if the alternative is disaster." BrainyQuote.com, those words had become a mantra for Frankie and the group. Today was the day they would take their work beyond the garage and the classroom. They were hosting the town's first ever electric vehicle expo, a showcase of their projects and a beacon of possibility for everyone, especially those who had long felt sidelined by time. Frankie's car. The cobbled-together Tesla Model S Plaid stood center stage, its sleek frame gleaming under the fluorescent lights, a symbol of stubborn hope and relentless effort. Neighbors, friends, and curious passers-by trickled in, eyes wide with wonder as they took in the bikes, scooters, and small EVs crafted by hands that had weathered decades of life storms. Frankie watched as Joan, once frail and hesitant, confidently demonstrated her refurbished scooter, beaming as she glided smoothly across the floor. The pride radiating from her was contagious. Emily, standing nearby with Max and Dylan, smiled proudly, her earlier worries melting away as she saw firsthand the lives this movement was changing. The event wasn't just about machines, it was about stories of resilience, of dreams deferred but not forgotten, of the quiet power that emerges when people refuse to be invisible. Frankie shared his story with visitors, speaking candidly about the years he'd felt like a ghost in his own life, until a spark, Elon Musk's audacity and vision, reminded him that limitation was often self-imposed. "Age is a number," Frankie said, voice steady and full of conviction, "but purpose is timeless." Throughout the day, laughter mingled with awe. Children asked endless questions about batteries and motors, teenagers marveled at the ingenuity of people who refused to let their years define them. The media caught wind of the event, and soon, a local news crew was filming interviews, capturing the spirit of the Plaid pioneers and their bold message. The story spread beyond the town's borders, carried by social media shares and heartfelt testimonials. Messages poured in, from people in nearby cities, from retired engineers, from those who had long felt forgotten but now found new hope. Frankie read through them late at night, eyes shining. One message stood out. "Your story made me realize I'm not too old to learn or dream. Thank you." He clutched his journal tightly, writing beneath the words, "The smallest spark can ignite the fiercest flame." That evening, the Plaid pioneers gathered in the dim glow of the center, their energy still humming from the day's success. They spoke of what was next, plans to expand their classes, collaborate with local schools, and even start a non-profit to provide tools and resources for seniors eager to learn. Frankie felt a surge of purpose unlike anything he'd known. He thought back to the early days, when his project was just a solitary dream in a cluttered garage. Now, it was a movement. A community. A promise that no one was ever truly too old to change the world. He remembered another Musk quote that had inspired him: "When Henry Ford made cheap, reliable cars, people said, 'Nah, what's wrong with a horse?' That was a huge bet he made, and it worked." Goodreads.com, Frankie realized that his own bet, building a car, building hope, was just as bold. And just as necessary. In the days that followed, Frankie's life shifted again. He was invited to speak at community events, sharing not just technical knowledge but the story of transformation that inspired so many. His car became a symbol of defiance against the quiet resignation too often accepted in later years. At home, Emily and Max grew closer to him, drawn not just by the car but by the man who refused to settle. Max, wide-eyed and eager, asked questions about engineering that surprised even Frankie. "I want to build something too," the boy said one afternoon, eyes sparkling. "Maybe a car that flies." Frankie laughed, a deep, joyful sound. "Then let's get to work." The journey was far from over. Challenges remained: funding, health concerns, skeptical voices, but each hurdle was met with renewed determination. Frankie learned to rest when needed, to ask for help, to embrace the slow but steady pace of progress. The Plaid pioneers grew into a family, bound not by blood but by shared dreams and unwavering support. One afternoon, as Frankie walked the town's main street, he noticed something new. A group of young adults gathered outside a workshop, tinkering with electric scooters and bikes. They looked up and waved. Frankie waved back, a warm smile spreading across his face. The movement had taken on a life of its own. And it was only just beginning. That night, Frankie sat by his garage, looking at the car bathed in moonlight. He thought about Elon Musk, the visionary who had sparked his journey, who had shown the world what was possible when fear was cast aside and boldness embraced. Frankie whispered to the night, "Thank you for the spark." And in that quiet moment, he knew that he was no longer alone. He was part of something bigger, a revolution of hope, of possibility, of unyielding spirit. The ride wasn't just about speed or power anymore. It was about the heart. About proving that no matter the years behind you, there is always a road forward. And Frankie was ready to keep driving. Despite the momentum and the growing support, Frankie felt a heavy shadow creeping into his thoughts. The initial excitement of the expo had faded into the daily grind, fundraising struggles, the aches of a body pushed too hard, and the relentless pressure of balancing hope with reality. One evening, as he sat alone in the quiet garage, the Tesla Model S Plaid gleaming under the harsh overhead light, doubts clawed at his mind. Was he chasing a dream that was slipping through his fingers? Was this journey a noble pursuit, or a stubborn refusal to accept the natural order of aging? The room was silent except for the soft hum of the battery charger. Frankie's fingers traced the edge of the steering wheel, the cool leather grounding him even as uncertainty swirled within. He thought about the skeptics, the council's thin support, the long list of obstacles yet to overcome. His body ached in ways that went beyond physical pain, there was an emotional exhaustion he hadn't anticipated. A voice echoed in his head, "Maybe it's time to slow down. Maybe it's time to let go." But deep down, another voice, the one sparked by Elon Musk's fearless spirit, refused to be silenced. Frankie remembered a quote he'd pinned on his workshop wall, "When something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor." That phrase had pulled him through the darkest nights and fueled the smallest victories. Yet tonight, the odds seemed overwhelming. He thought of the late nights, the missed family dinners, the sacrifices Emily had made quietly so he could chase this dream. He wondered if he was being selfish. Was his passion lifting others or weighing them down? A knock on the door broke his reverie. It was Joan, her face etched with concern but also determination. She carried a small toolbox and an energy that refused to be dimmed. "I thought you might need a hand," she said softly, stepping into the garage. Frankie smiled faintly, grateful for her presence. Together, they worked on the car's intricate systems, hands moving with practiced ease but hearts heavy with unspoken worries. As they tightened bolts and tested circuits, Joan shared her own doubts, the fear of failure, the pain of feeling invisible for so long, the weight of starting over at their age. "Sometimes," she said, "I wonder if we're chasing ghosts. If we're just holding on to what's gone." Frankie nodded. "But then I remember why we started. It's not about the car or the tech. It's about proving to ourselves that we still matter. That we can still build, still dream, still change." Joan smiled, eyes shining with renewed resolve. "Then let's keep building." That night, Frankie lay awake, the ceiling above a canvas for swirling thoughts. He thought about Elon Musk's journey, how the billionaire had faced bankruptcy, public ridicule, and near failure, yet never gave up. Musk's relentless drive wasn't about ego, it was about purpose. It was about pushing past fear to create something meaningful. Frankie realized his own crossroads wasn't just about continuing or quitting, it was about redefining what success meant for him now. It wasn't about fame or fortune, it was about impact, connection, and authenticity. The next morning, he gathered the Plaid pioneers for an honest conversation. He shared his doubts openly, inviting them to do the same. The room was filled with a quiet vulnerability, a collective recognition of the fears that threatened to unravel their progress. But then, someone spoke, Max, Emily's son, whose youthful enthusiasm was a balm for weary souls. "I think this is just the beginning," Max said. "We're all learning, but we're building something that can outlast us." His words sparked a fire in the group. They recommitted to the project, not because it was easy, but because it was worth it. Together, they crafted a new plan, one that embraced the challenges and leaned into collaboration, innovation, and community support. Frankie took a lesson from Musk's bold moves and audacious goals, setting a clear vision for what the Plaid pioneers could become. As the weeks passed, Frankie found his stride again. He balanced work with rest, leaned on his friends and family, and kept the spark alive. The doubts didn't disappear, they never would, but they no longer controlled him. Instead, they became part of the journey, reminders of the stakes and the strength required to keep moving forward. One crisp afternoon, as Frankie tested a new battery prototype with Joan and Max, he felt a deep sense of peace. The road ahead was still long and uncertain, but he was ready. Ready to face whatever came next with courage, resilience, and an unshakable belief that the best chapters were still unwritten. In that moment, he whispered to himself, "I'm not done yet. Not by a long shot." And with that, the engine of hope roared back to life. The afternoon sun filtered softly through the curtains of Frankie's modest living room, casting warm patterns on the faded carpet and well-worn furniture. The familiar scent of coffee mingled with the distant hum of the Tesla Model S Plaid resting quietly in the garage. But inside Frankie's heart, there was a restless ache, an old wound that refused to fully heal. Family had always been complicated. Years ago, as Frankie poured his energy into work and invention, his marriage to Emily frayed, and his relationship with Max, his grandson, grew distant. The regrets settled like dust on every shelf, a missed birthday, a forgotten call, a harsh word left unsaid. The Plaid pioneers and the electric car had given him purpose, yes, but they hadn't erased the silent void left by broken connections. One evening, after a community event, Emily sat beside him on the porch, the soft chirp of crickets filling the air. "You've come so far, Frankie. But there's still something I see you avoid." Her voice was gentle but steady. "It's Max. You two barely talk anymore. You need to try." Frankie looked down at his hands, rough and calloused, fingers tracing invisible patterns on his jeans. He nodded slowly. "I know. I've been afraid. Afraid he won't want to listen. That I've lost him." Emily squeezed his hand. "It's never too late." Inspired by Elon Musk's relentless pursuit of his goals, even when facing immense personal and professional challenges, Frankie decided it was time to reach out, not just as a grandfather, but as a man willing to rebuild. He called Max one afternoon, voice tentative but sincere. "Hey, Max. I was wondering if you'd want to come by this weekend. I've got something to show you." There was a pause on the other end, then a quiet, "Sure, Grandpa." The next day, Max arrived, cautious but curious. Frankie led him to the garage, where the Tesla Model S Plaid gleamed under the overhead lights. "This is what I've been working on," Frankie said, pride softening the edges of his voice. Max's eyes lit up. "It's amazing. How does it go so fast?" Frankie smiled, grateful for the opening. "It's all about persistence and pushing boundaries. You know, kind of like how Elon Musk talks about taking risks and never giving up." They spent hours tinkering together, Max eagerly soaking up every detail, Frankie patiently explaining each part. As the afternoon faded into evening, the barriers began to crumble. Max shared stories of school, friends, and his own dreams of inventing things that could change the world. Frankie listened, truly listened, feeling a bridge being built, one bolt, one conversation, one shared moment at a time. Over the following weeks, their bond grew stronger. Max became a regular presence in the garage, his youthful energy rekindling Frankie's passion. Emily watched with quiet relief as the grandfather and grandson rediscovered each other, laughter and hope filling the spaces that had once held silence. But rebuilding wasn't always smooth. There were moments of frustration and old wounds resurfacing. Frankie stumbled over words, unsure how to express years of regret. Max, at times, withdrew, wary of reopening painful gaps. Yet, like the careful calibration of the car's systems, their relationship required patience, adjustment, and steady commitment. Frankie often thought about Musk's ability to embrace failure as a stepping stone rather than a dead end. He realized the same applied here. Every misstep was an opportunity to try again, to grow closer, to heal. One evening, as they worked side by side tightening bolts and connecting wires, Max suddenly stopped and looked at Frankie. "I'm glad you didn't give up on this, or on me." Frankie's throat tightened. "Me too, kiddo. Me too." That simple exchange carried more weight than any victory lap or media headline. It was a testament to the power of persistence, not just in invention, but in love and family. Frankie's renewed relationship with Max rippled outward, inspiring others in the Plaid pioneers and beyond. Stories emerged of fractured families finding common ground, of lost connections rekindled through shared passion and purpose. At a community gathering, Joan approached Frankie with a soft smile. "I see you're rebuilding more than just cars, Frankie. You're rebuilding lives." He nodded, feeling the truth in her words. "It's the hardest build of all." Inspired by this new chapter, Frankie and Emily decided to host monthly family days at the senior center, events where generations could come together to learn, share, and create. The goal was simple: to bridge gaps, foster understanding, and remind everyone that no matter the past, the future could always be rewritten. One crisp Saturday morning, the center buzzed with energy. Children ran between tables covered with tools and projects, elders shared stories and skills, and laughter echoed through the halls. Frankie watched as Max taught a group of kids about electric motors, his confidence shining bright. Emily joined a circle of mothers, exchanging recipes and smiles. The room felt alive with possibility. Later, as the sun dipped low, Frankie sat on a bench outside, Max by his side. "You think we can change the world?" Max asked, eyes wide. Frankie smiled, the lines on his face deepening with hope. "I know we can. One spark at a time." In those moments, Frankie understood that legacy wasn't about monuments or fame. It was about the connections we nurture, the barriers we break, and the hope we pass on. Elon Musk's fearless example had shown him that age was not a cage but a key, unlocking doors to new beginnings, to courage, to love. Frankie whispered into the fading light, "We're just getting started." And with that, a new chapter unfolded, one built on the unbreakable bonds of family, fueled by passion, and destined to inspire generations yet to come. The dawn broke cool and clear over the small town, a pale golden light spilling across the quiet streets and sleepy houses. Frankie stood outside his garage, the Tesla Model S Plaid gleaming in the early morning sun like a promise waiting to be fulfilled. His heart pounded, not from fear exactly, but from the electric hum of anticipation. Today was the day. After months of tinkering, tweaking, and tireless work, the car was ready for its first proper test drive. He'd read Elon Musk's words countless times, the vision of pushing beyond limits, of failing forward, resonating deep within him. Persistence is very important. You should not give up unless you are forced to give up. That mantra echoed in Frankie's mind as he ran his hand over the smooth hood, feeling the cool metal beneath his fingertips. Max was there too, his eyes shining with excitement and a hint of nervousness. "Are you ready, Grandpa?" he asked, barely able to contain his enthusiasm. Frankie smiled, nodding. "Ready as I'll ever be." The streets were still quiet, the early morning calm broken only by birdsong and the distant hum of a waking town. Frankie slid into the driver's seat, the familiar scent of leather and new machinery enveloping him. He adjusted the mirrors, fastened his seatbelt, and took a deep breath. The touchscreen dashboard flickered to life, a silent promise of power and precision. He tapped the accelerator gently, and the car responded with a smooth, electric purr, a heartbeat of energy waiting to surge. The neighborhood was still waking as Frankie pulled onto the road, the tires humming softly on the asphalt. The Model S Plaid handled with grace and confidence, every turn and stop a testament to countless hours of dedication. As he picked up speed, a thrill surged through him, not just from the car's power, but from the freedom it represented. For years, Frankie had felt trapped, by age, by doubt, by the weight of lost opportunities. Now, behind the wheel, he felt alive in a way he hadn't in decades. Mac sat beside him, grinning ear to ear, marveling at the quiet strength of the machine. "It's so fast," he exclaimed, eyes wide. Frankie chuckled. "And that's just the beginning." They drove through the winding roads that bordered the town, the world blurring gently past the windows. With every mile, Frankie's confidence grew, the car responding flawlessly to his commands. Yet beneath the exhilaration was a flicker of anxiety. What if something went wrong? What if all the effort was for nothing? But then he remembered another Musk quote, "Failure is an option here. If things are not failing, you are not innovating enough." Frankie embraced the uncertainty as part of the journey, a challenge to overcome rather than a threat to fear. Halfway through the test drive, they stopped at a scenic overlook, the town spread out like a miniature world below them. Frankie stepped out of the car, feeling the cool breeze brush against his face. Max joined him, both of them gazing out over the familiar landscape with a new sense of possibility. "We did this," Max said softly, breaking the silence. "You did this, Grandpa. And you showed me that it's never too late." Frankie felt a lump rise in his throat. "We did this. Together." As they climbed back into the car, a sense of purpose settled over Frankie. The test drive wasn't just a technical milestone, it was a declaration. A statement that age, fear, and doubt would no longer hold him back. That the road ahead was open, wide, and waiting. On the drive home, the car's headlights cut through the growing dusk, casting long shadows on the pavement. Frankie's mind raced with ideas, improvements to make, plans to share, a future to build. Emily was waiting by the door when they pulled into the driveway, a warm smile lighting her face. "How was it?" she asked, her eyes sparkling with hope. Frankie reached for her hand, the warmth grounding him. "Better than I ever imagined." That night, as he lay in bed, Frankie felt the pulse of possibility thrumming through his veins. The Tesla Model S Plaid was more than a machine, it was a symbol of transformation, resilience, and unyielding spirit. Just like Elon Musk had shown the world, Frankie understood now that the fastest path wasn't always the easiest, but it was always worth the ride. He closed his eyes and whispered into the quiet room, "This is just the beginning." And with that, a new journey launched, one filled with speed, strength, and the fearless heart of a man who refused to stop dreaming. The buzz of conversation in the town hall meeting was thick with tension, the air heavy with doubt and whispered skepticism. Frankie stood near the back, his hands clenched at his sides as he watched the crowd. Faces he had known for decades twisted with disbelief or outright dismissal. "Why waste your time on that electric car nonsense?" one man muttered, loud enough for a few others to hear. "He's too old to be starting anything new." Another woman shook her head, voice sharp and cold. "There's no future in chasing Elon Musk's dreams here. We should focus on what's real and practical." Frankie's heart pounded, a mixture of frustration and hurt bubbling beneath his calm exterior. This was the hardest part, not the physical toll, not the technical challenges, but the weight of being doubted and dismissed. The room felt like a courtroom, every word a verdict on his worth, on his dream, on his very identity. He thought back to the early days of Musk's ventures, the countless headlines filled with skepticism and scorn. Tesla nearly collapsed, SpaceX faced failure after failure. But Musk had pressed on, undeterred by the chorus of naysayers. Frankie found a quiet corner and pulled out his phone, scrolling through a speech Musk had given months earlier, "When something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor." That line steadied him like a lifeline. Taking a deep breath, Frankie stepped forward, clearing his throat to command attention. I know this project isn't easy. I know it's different. And yes, I'm older than most starting something like this. But I'm not doing this for me alone. I'm doing it for all of us, to show that age isn't a limit, to ignite hope, and to build something that lasts. The room quieted, some eyes softening, others skeptical but attentive. Frankie spoke with raw honesty, sharing his journey. The regrets, the doubts, the spark that refused to die. He spoke of Elon Musk's fearlessness, not as a distant icon but as a real example of pushing past limits. We all have doubts, Frankie said. But what defines us is how we face them. This isn't just about a car, it's about proving that we're not done. That we still have a purpose. That we can still change. The mayor, a gruff man who had voiced his skepticism earlier, stood and nodded slowly. Frankie, it's easy to dismiss new ideas. But your passion and persistence are hard to ignore. Let's find a way to support you, responsibly. The room shifted, a subtle but meaningful thaw in the coldness. Outside, Frankie exhaled deeply, the pressure lifting just a bit. Still, the internal battle raged. That night, alone in the garage, he stared at the Tesla Model S Plaid. The car gleamed with quiet power, but Frankie's mind wrestled with a storm of insecurities. Was he chasing a fool's errand? Was his dream worth the strain on those who cared about him? He reached for his journal and wrote, drawing strength from Musk's fearless mindset, fear is a reaction. Courage is a decision. The next morning, Joan stopped by with fresh coffee and a steady smile. Don't let them get to you, she said. You're doing what most people only dream of. Remember Musk's failures? They didn't stop him, and they shouldn't stop you. Together, they outlined new strategies, ways to address concerns, engage the community, and showcase the project's potential benefits. The Plaid pioneers rallied around Frankie, their collective energy a shield against doubt. Days turned into weeks, and slowly, the tide began to turn. Local news outlets picked up the story, painting a picture of determination and innovation. Town meetings shifted from criticism to curiosity. Frankie found himself invited to speak at schools and clubs, inspiring others with his journey. Through it all, he clung to the lessons Musk had taught him, embracing failure, valuing persistence, and never losing sight of the vision. One afternoon, as he gave a talk at the senior center, Frankie looked out at the audience, faces of all ages, some skeptical, some hopeful. He shared not just his technical knowledge, but his story of transformation. I was once afraid to try, he admitted. But then I realized fear is just a wall we build. And walls can be torn down. As applause filled the room, Frankie felt a surge of validation, not from approval, but from knowing he had faced the critics and stood firm. That night, he called Max, you know, kid, he said, voice warm, sometimes the hardest part isn't building the car, it's building belief. But I'm ready for the challenge. Max's laughter came through the line, bright and encouraging. You've got this, Grandpa. Just keep going. Frankie hung up, a smile spreading across his face. Elon Musk's voice echoed once more in his mind. When something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor. And with that, Frankie made a silent vow, to keep pushing, keep dreaming, and keep facing whatever critics came his way. Because this wasn't just about a car. It was about proving that it's never too late to rewrite your story. The morning air was crisp with the promise of change as Frankie unlocked the garage, the scent of fresh oil and polished metal greeting him like an old friend. The Tesla Model S Plaid sat proudly under the fluorescent lights, every curve and detail a testament to months of dedication, late nights, and relentless hope. Yet, this morning felt different, not just because of the steady hum of the car's battery system or the software of the charging port, but because of the buzz building outside his little workshop. Word had spread. The community, once skeptical, was now watching. And Frankie could feel the tension between doubt and possibility shimmering in the air like static electricity. Max was already there, his face glowing with excitement, fingers deftly adjusting the wiring on a prototype dashboard display. "Grandpa, look at this. I finished the new interface last night. It's faster, smoother, and it even has a learning mode to adapt to the driver's habits." Frankie smiled, pride swelling in his chest. Watching Max grow from a distant grandson into a passionate collaborator had been one of the most unexpected gifts of this journey. "You keep surprising me, kid," Frankie said, ruffling Max's hair. Elon would be proud. They had spent the past weeks presenting their project at local schools, community centers, and small tech fairs. What had started as curiosity was blossoming into genuine excitement. People who once dismissed the idea of an electric car built by a retired man and his grandson were now lining up to see the Plaid in action. Invitations arrived from neighboring towns, and even a regional news crew had shown up to capture the story. But the real spark came unexpectedly. One afternoon, as Frankie prepared for a demonstration in the town square, a voice rang out from the crowd, a sharp, familiar tone tinged with surprise and grudging respect. It was Tom Benson, the local factory owner and one of Frankie's most vocal critics. "I never thought I'd say this," Tom began, stepping forward, "but you've done something remarkable here." The crowd hushed. Frankie met Tom's gaze, steady and open. "I'm not ready to jump on the bandwagon," Tom continued, "but your persistence and the quality of your work can't be ignored. I want to help, in whatever way I can." The room erupted in applause, the shift palpable and electrifying. Frankie felt a surge of validation, not just for himself, but for every person who had ever felt overlooked or underestimated. It was a turning point. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Frankie sat on his porch, the cool breeze whispering through the trees. Emily joined him, her hand finding his. "You've lit a fire, Frankie. Not just in the car or the town, but in yourself." He nodded, eyes reflecting the fading light. "It's more than just building a car. It's about proving that we're still here, still capable, still valuable." Her smile was soft but fierce. "And you've inspired more people than you realize." In the days that followed, the project accelerated. The Plaid pioneers expanded, new volunteers joining with ideas, skills, and fresh enthusiasm. They organized workshops teaching basic engineering to seniors, hosted youth mentorship programs, and planned a showcase event for the entire region. Frankie's dream was no longer just his, it was becoming a movement. Yet, amid the excitement, Frankie remained grounded. He knew the road ahead was long and fraught with challenges. The car still needed refinement, funding was tight, and skeptics still lingered in the shadows. But the spark had been lit, and it was burning brighter than ever. One night, as he reviewed blueprints under the glow of a single lamp, Frankie paused and whispered to himself. "Elon said, some people don't like change, but you need to embrace change if the alternative is disaster. I'm ready." His fingers traced the lines on the paper, each mark a step toward transformation, not just of technology, but of life. The crescendo came at the regional showcase, held in the renovated town hall packed with neighbors, journalists, and local officials. Frankie took the stage, heart pounding but voice steady. He spoke not just about the car's specs, but about the journey, the fears faced, the bridges rebuilt, the hope reignited. Max demonstrated the car's features with youthful enthusiasm, their partnership a living symbol of possibility across generations. As the Tesla Model S Plaid rolled onto the floor, the crowd erupted in cheers. Cameras flashed, questions flew, and hands reached out to touch the sleek exterior. Frankie caught Emily's eye, their smiles reflecting the unspoken truth: they had done more than build a car. They had built a legacy. After the event, as the crowd thinned, a young woman approached Frankie, eyes shining with determination. "I'm working on clean energy projects in college," she said. "Your story, it gives me hope. That even when things seem impossible, we can make a difference." Frankie felt tears prick his eyes. "Thank you," he whispered. "That means everything." That night, back in the quiet of his workshop, Frankie looked at the Tesla Model S Plaid one last time before shutting down the lights. The car hummed softly, a sleeping giant ready to race into tomorrow. He felt a profound peace, a recognition that the spark he'd ignited was no longer just his own. It belonged to everyone willing to believe that change is possible at any age. Elon Musk's relentless drive had been the spark that started the fire. But Frankie had fanned the flames with courage, love, and unwavering hope. And as he turned away from the car and toward the future, he knew the best was yet to come. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?